Hello, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week, we're going to continue our discussion that we began last week, having to do with consciousness, specifically that subjective nature of consciousness that we call qualia. So, last time, we saw Nagel argue that you'll never be able to understand the subjective character of experience from an objective point of view, that sort of thing won't be possible. We then saw Kathleen Aikens argue that that isn't necessarily the case, that perhaps that's too pessimistic. Nevertheless, there are many philosophers of mind who follow Nagel in his thinking. There is something special about that subjective character of experience. Some of them, as we're going to see today, think that that subjective nature of experience is something that cannot be captured by any physical explanation. So, where Nagel wants to talk about objective explanations versus subjective ones, the people we're going to hear from today are talking about physical explanations versus other explanations, right? Okay, so today we're going to see two different kinds of arguments that attempt to motivate this idea that qualia show us that physicalism has to be false. Physicalism has to be false. These two arguments are going to be the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument. So the knowledge argument comes from Frank Jackson, and the idea is pretty simple. It just says this: if you can know all of the physical facts and still not know everything there is to know, then physicalism has to be wrong. Why? Well, because physicalism is just the view that everything is physical, and therefore all of the facts ought to be physical facts. So if I can show you an instance of a non physical fact, I have then shown you that physicalism is false. That's the idea. So Jackson is going to think that, or he's going to claim that there is some kind of non physical fact. Therefore, we can conclude physicalism just is false. All right, what is that non physical fact? Well, as you've likely suspected, it has to do with qualia. It has to do with that subjective nature of experience that Nagel has been talking about thus far in the semester. Okay, so to draw out this conclusion, Jackson offers us something of a thought experiment. So he has us consider this remarkable color scientist, Mary, right? She knows everything there is to know about the physical facts, especially perhaps where color is concerned, right? Where color perception is concerned. She knows what brain states are involved. She knows everything there is to know about brains, about wavelengths, about in the entire physical universe altogether. If there is a physical fact, Mary knows it. Okay, but the trade-off is that she's locked away in this black and white room. She has, untold number of black and white books. She has access to all of these TVs and a computer, but they only display things in black and white. So she knows everything there is to know about the physical world. Okay. Suppose then that one day Mary is let out of her laboratory, right? Mary's let out of the black and white room. She then encounters a red apple. Does Mary learn anything new when she encounters the red apple? If you think so, note that what you're saying is that even though Mary knew everything there was to know physically, she still somehow gets to learn something more. So this implies then that there's something that's non-physical that Mary did not know. That is the conclusion that Jackson thinks we should draw, that there is some non-physical fact that Mary gains only when she has an experience of the red apple herself, right? What is this? This non-physical fact? Well, it's the character of subjective experience. It's the quality, the qualia of subjective experience. Okay, so before moving on to objections to his view, Jackson considers a few different kinds of misunderstandings that we might have about his scenario. First, he wants to clarify this is not about what Mary can and cannot imagine. As he says, quote, imagination is a faculty that those who lack knowledge need to fall back on. In other words, because we're saying Mary knows absolutely everything about the physical world, we don't need to talk about Mary's ability to imagine. She doesn't need to imagine anything about the physical world. She knows everything, right? You only need to imagine when you don't already know. Okay, so we're not talking about her capacities of imagination. We're talking about the limits of her knowledge. Point two, Mary's new knowledge here can't be attributed to some previous error in logic or reasoning, right? A kind of error wherein she should have related one concept to another, but something went wrong, right? Something went wrong and she failed to make the connection. In the same way that you might fail to make the connection that Superman is Clark Kent, right? So she knew all of these physical facts, but failed to make some kind of connection. That's why it seems like Mary learned something. But really, it's just a failure of inference. Jackson wants to say no, the kind of knowledge that Mary gains here is not the kind of knowledge that one could have just sitting there reflecting on all the inferences they've made. Ah, I see I've made an incorrect inference here, and if I correct that, this makes sense now. No, Jackson wants to say this is a real kind of discovery. It's a kind of knowledge that cannot be gained without experience. Right? So it is not just a logical mistake. Finally, Jackson wants to make it clear that Mary is not just learning something about her experiences. She's learning something about what it's like to experience in general, right? What it's like to experience for other people too. Okay. Now, the reason why Jackson needs to make this clarification is because if Mary is only learning something about her own experience, the physicalist has a pretty easy way out, right? All they have to say is that, well, yes, Mary knew all of the physical facts that were available to her, but there are some physical facts that perhaps cannot be gained until you're in the right kind of circumstance, like when you're in front of an apple, right? And therefore, she really just didn't have the opportunity to learn everything new. Jackson wants to say, sure, that seems to work. But it doesn't work when we think about other people's experience. Mary did have all of the facts necessary, Jackson thinks, to understand a person's experience from a physical point of view, some other person's experience. She knows what their brain would do. She knows how their eyes perform in relation to, certain wavelengths striking them. She knows all of these facts, all of them. But she still learned something new about other people's experience of color, of the redness of this apple, by being let out of the room. So it's not just about Mary's own knowledge. It's about her, or it's not just about her knowledge of herself. It's knowledge about experience in general, right? Knowledge about experience in general. Now, do note that that seems perhaps to be in contention with what we were hearing Nagel argue last week, right? Nagel wanted to say that this move from the subjective to the objective is something that we ought to do when we're trying to describe some kind of external phenomena like lightning. But when we're trying to describe experience, this is probably not what we should do. Why? Because by externalizing our own subjective perspective, right, we lose the phenomena altogether. There is no describing my perspective without me, right? And therefore, this notion of Jackson's that Mary is somehow learning something about other people's experience might not work if Nagel's view is true, right? In order to do so, it seems like Mary would need to be able to establish some kind of objective view of qualitative experience. which Nagel seems to say is impossible. Right? Okay, but let's move on to the objections that Jackson considers. The objections that he considers, for the most part, come from the neurophilosopher Paul Churchland. So we're going to hear some more from the Churchlands later. Paul Churchland and Patricia Churchland are a husband and wife duo who talk about philosophy of mind. Specifically, they talk about neurophilosophy, right? They are what you might call eliminativists. They think that there really is nothing to talk about other than the brain, and they're very serious about that. So to call them physicalist is something of an understatement. So Paul Churchland has given several objections to Jackson's conclusion that Mary gained some kind of new knowledge, and Jackson is going to run through several of them. The first objection that Jackson considers here is this argument that Mary does not learn anything new when let out of her room. Instead, the thought goes, Mary gains some kind of new ability. She gains like a new conception. She gains a new way of thinking about the same thing in a different way. Okay? If this works, then we could say that, quote, Mary knew all that there was to know about the experiences of others beforehand, but lacked an ability until after her release. If this works, then we can say that, yeah, Mary did learn something when she got let out of her room, but she did not learn any new physical facts. She did not learn any new physical facts. She just learned a new way of thinking. She just learned a new way of thinking. If that succeeds, then it's not clear that physicalism is false. Right? She did not learn any new physical facts. So physicalism still seems to be at least on the table. Okay, so Jackson responds to this by saying that, yeah, sure, I can't prove to you that Mary would gain some kind of new factual knowledge when she leaves the room. However, it's plausible that she does. Jackson wants to say, you cannot deny that it is at least plausible that Mary learns something new when she leaves the room, and that something new is not just a skill, but it's some kind of fact, right? If that is plausible, then his conclusion that follows from it is also plausible. And that conclusion is that physicalism is false. So at the least, Jackson wants to say, it's still plausible that his conclusion is true, that physicalism is false. Okay, so Jackson here is kind of weakening the view, right? He's saying, okay, sure, maybe I can't show you, maybe I can't demonstrate to you that physicalism is false full out, but I can still give you some good reason to think that it might be, right? All right. The next objection then is that we could construct a similar kind of scenario targeting dualism. So Churchland considers that maybe Mary's black and white TVs don't just tell her all about the physical facts, maybe they tell her all about whatever the mental substance is that the dualist uses, right? So she now knows all of the dualist facts, right? She knows about all the physical stuff, but she also knows about what Churchland calls the ectoplasm, right? The stuff that's not physical. She knows all the facts about that stuff too. Well, if she learned all of those facts and we run her through the same situation where, well, she encounters a red apple for the first time, Nagel wants to say, Churchland wants to say, we're still going to find the same result, right? We're still going to say that she learned something new. And therefore, by Jackson's own lights, we should say that dualism is also false. Okay. Jackson's response is to basically deny that we could do this, is to deny that we could give all of the dualist facts to Mary without her having these kinds of experiences. Basically, to say that, look, these facts about the ectoplasm, or whatever you might want to call it, they're going to be limited. We're not going to be able to give all of them because some of those things do require experience. Those qualitative facts, for example, the qualia, cannot be gained without the experience. So Jackson's response here is to more or less deny that that scenario is feasible. Okay. There are some other strategies for trying to resist Jackson's conclusion, however. Okay. So the first, by far most common, is to just deny that Mary learns anything new at all, right? Or that she, at best, learns something new, but it's just like a different way of thinking or imagining, right? It's not a new fact, it's just a new way of thinking. So, more sophisticated attempts at this kind of strategy argue that if Mary really knew all of the physical facts, this would include knowledge about color perception, including sensations of qualia, right? So if everything really is physical, if we take physicalism seriously, and you say that this person knows all the physical facts, well, that means if there is anything like an experience of qualia, by the rules, Mary should know it. Mary should know it. And therefore, by the rules, when she leaves the room, she does not learn anything new when she encounters the red apple for the first time. Right? Others argue that only some kinds of physical knowledge can be gained in a sort of third person way. That is, there are different kinds of physical knowledge. A lot of it can be gained in this objective third person perspective, right? Wherein I look at your brain, for example, I can learn a lot of things about your brain. But there are other things that can only be learned from a first person perspective by experiencing them ourselves. So she does learn something new when she's released from her laboratory. But it's only because she's now allowed to take this first person perspective. It's the same fact, it's the same physical fact. She's just learning what it's like to experience it from the first person perspective. This somewhat mirrors what we were hearing from Nagel earlier, that there is something different about having a perspective, right? There's something different about occupying a perspective. But the idea this time is that that might help the physicalist. It might be that there's certain ways of appreciating physical facts that have personal perspectival character, right? Jackson himself, much later, comes to reject dualism, the view that he's trying to motivate here, and to think that Mary simply learns a new way of thinking about physical properties of the world, right? So Jackson himself inevitably ends up thinking that the knowledge argument doesn't quite work, right? It does not quite show that physicalism is false. Indeed, he goes on to accept a form of physicalism. That doesn't mean, however, that the knowledge argument does not work. Just because the person who came up with it finds themselves disagreeing later does not mean that it doesn't work, right? In fact, many people still today think that the knowledge argument is one of the strongest reasons for preferring something like a non-physicalist view of the mind, right? It seems like the physical facts about the world do not exhaust all of the facts about the world. If qualia, the qualitative character of experience, cannot be captured by physical knowledge, by physical facts, and qualia are something that we want to commit to, then it seems like physicalism might not work, right? Okay, to make the point further, we could look towards the conceivability argument. So there's a variety of these. There's a variety of conceivability arguments, but by far the most popular is David Chalmers's zombie argument. Okay, so Amy Kind here from our reading gives like a snapshot view of the conceivability argument, but there is a lot of literature on this particular move. So the basic idea is this. Chalmers wants us to imagine some creatures that are physically identical to us, right? Their bodies are the exact same when it comes to anatomical structure, perhaps even atomic structure. They respond to pain in the exact same way that we do. You prick their finger with a pin, they go, ah! They have exactly identical responses to stimuli in the way that we do. Okay? They have the exact same brain states. What makes these creatures zombie-like, because again, we're talking about zombies here, is that we're asked to imagine that they don't have those qualitative states of experience that Nagel's been talking about. So for them, there is nothing that it's like to be in pain or to experience red. Sure, they might have some kind of behaviors to do with what happens when they, put their hand on the stove or their fingers pricked, right? But that doesn't mean they have any feeling of what it's like to be in pain. So the point is this: if you can conceive of a philosophical zombie, an entity that's physically identical to you but does not have these qualitative states, then what you are saying is that it's conceivable that all the physical facts about ourselves can remain the same while losing certain mental facts. This seems to imply that the physical facts are not all there are to understanding consciousness. So once again, it looks like physicalism is ultimately going to be incomplete. Okay, so as we saw with the knowledge argument, there are going to be a number of challenges here. The most prominent one is just going to be to object to this move from conceivability to possibility. That is, just because something might seem conceivable, it doesn't necessarily hold that that thing is possible. So it might be, in other words, that these philosophical zombies are conceivable, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that that they're actually possible. Okay, so to understand this, we need to know more about what conceivability and possibility are, where philosophers are concerned. When philosophers are talking about conceivability, we're typically talking about the limits of rational imagining. So, what can you think of? What can you conjure up in your mind without requiring any kind of logical contradiction? Whatever that is conceivable. So, for example, the existence of Santa Claus, that's conceivable. I can think of Santa Claus, right? This man who wears a red uniform at the North Pole, has elves, delivers presents. I can think of Santa Claus. And thinking of Santa Claus does not seem to require any kind of contradiction. However, something like the existence of a square with no sides is not conceivable. I can't even picture what it would be like for there to be a square with no sides. It does involve a contradiction. So, square with no sides, not conceivable. Philosophical zombie? Sure, it seems conceivable, right? I can picture it. I can picture the description, right? This is a being that's physically identical to me. It has no what its likeness to its experiences. Okay, I can imagine that without any kind of logical contradiction. But possibility, on the other hand, is usually something a little stronger than that. To say that something is possible in philosophy is typically to say that it actually could have happened in a world that's at least somewhat like ours, right? So, should our world have been even slightly different and this thing could have occurred, means to say that it is possible. It's possible, in other words, that Germany could have won World War II. That's possible. I could see it happening in a world that's different from ours, but very, very similar. But it is probably not possible that Santa Claus exists. Why? Because there's no such thing as magic in our world, right? The kind of magic that Santa Claus requires, being able to, deliver presents to all of the children in the world in a very short time period, right? It's that doesn't seem like it exists in our world. And therefore, even though Santa Claus was conceivable, It doesn't seem like Santa Claus is possible. Okay, so the idea of this objection then is to say that philosophical zombies could be conceivable without saying they're anything like a possibility. Therefore, it could still be that physicalism is true, right? These philosophical zombies might not be possible because we live in a physicalist world. Doesn't mean they're not conceivable. So they're objecting to this move that Chalmers is making between conceivability and possibility. Other objections typically try to refute the scenario before it even starts, right? They try to say, well, no, if physicalism is true, I cannot actually conceive of a being that has identical physical characteristics as me uh, and is somehow still unlike me. That's not even conceivable, right? So this is an objection to even the conceivability of the notion. Right? Is to say, look, if physicalism is true, if I'm a physicalist, and I think really there just are physical things and that's it, there's no way for me to imagine a thing that's exactly like me, but still somehow not like me. Right? That itself seems to involve a contradiction. There is something that is completely like me, but is also not like me. Seems like a contradiction, right? So there are a few different ways of pushing back on the conceivability argument. But the conclusion that we should draw here is that these problems we keep encountering are cyclical, right? We started off by getting bogged down, really, with the mind body problem because we thought that there might be something about the mind that made it distinct from the body, right? I look at my body, I look at my brain, it seems like I'm not seeing all that there is to see where my mind is concerned. So from there, we saw numerous positions trying to figure out exactly what that relationship is. We saw some that said, look, there has to be like a distinction, right? There's a mind and a body. The two are not the same. We saw other views say, well, okay, I know that it seems like that, but in actuality, they are just the same, right? Identity theory. Ultimately, we arrived at functionalism, which tried to get away from the mind body problem, right? It tried to adopt a view that said, look, I don't really care how the mind ends up being realized, whether it's in physical stuff or non-physical stuff. The only thing that matters where a mind is concerned are the functional roles. That's it. And those things can be expressed anywhere by anything, so long as they do it adequately. There's a mind. But then we saw from Ned Block that functionalists seem to leave out a story where qualia is concerned. They don't seem to provide any kind of story about qualia. Well, this week we've seen that talking about qualia get us back into this mind-body problem all over again. If it seems like physicalism cannot account for qualia, then it seems like physicalism has to be false. But if it is, we're back in this mind-body problem all over again. Now, that's not to say that the physicalists don't have their own answers. We've already seen some of the objections to the knowledge problem and the conceivability problem that we've seen today, but there are going to be more responses as we go forward. So next week, we're going to turn to the nature of the hard problem of consciousness directly. How do we account for qualia? So we're going to hear from Chalmers again next week. He does a really good job at defining the problem and telling us what our available solutions are, right? Which ones of them really are non-starters and which ones are actually in contention. And then we're going to hear from Patricia Churchland, who is going to try to argue that physicalists do have an answer to this problem. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.